Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thanks so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you are up this week.
Ooh, yep.
What have you brought to the table today?
I'm bringing the In Our Own Hands toolkit, which was created by Rania Mujamer. And this is an amazing collection of activities and guided discussions designed for kids to critically reflect on the role of police and policing in our society and what a world without them might look like.
Yes.
And so I say it's designed for kids, and it's designed for adults to use with kids.
Correct.
Right? Like,
yes.
There's activities throughout where she's talking to and writing for, an adult figure to use with a kid in their life.
Absolutely.
And so the activities included are Getting Curious, which has questions for rethinking police and prisons, Bad versus Good, which chips away at that either or binary of bad and good,
Yep.
Punishment versus Consequences, which analyzes the differences between these two things, Copaganda, which does kind of what it says it does, and dives into the stories that we learn about the police, and In Our Own Hands, which gets into the concept of transformative justice and some conflict resolution kind of stuff, and Community Safety, which looks into the amount of money that's spent on policing in our own communities and some of the ways that we could maybe shift those fundings to find other ways to generate community safety.
Right.
And then ends with a list of books called Radical Reads.
Oh, yeah.
Which has age-appropriate books. So like, I think 0 to 6, 7 plus, and then teens and up. So that they can read more about these concepts or stories sort of connected to these concepts.
Yep.
And this is such a great resource for kids, but also helpful for entry-level conversations into these kind of ideas about abolition for anyone.
Yes.
Because it gets at the foundation of a lot of these concepts and gets you thinking about the purpose of police, what we believe about them versus what we know to be true, and how much of this is deeply ingrained in so much of our culture.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great resource. I wanted to add real quick, I have it here. I forgot to type up the subtitle.
Okay.
So the whole title, In Our Own Hands, Tools for Talking About Abolition and Transformative Justice with Little Ones.
Yes. Very, very
So,
good.
that's the full title with the subtitle. Damien, what hit you about it? What would you like about it?
I like that you've got the printout there.
I do.
Very, very
I
good.
like to highlight tactily.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. That's a great intro to this. I think this was really an incredible resource, certainly for, as you say, adults to use with the kids in their lives, but I think really for all of us, right? And I like how you sort of, named it as like an entry-level sort of way or to enable folks to have entry-level conversations about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it really is a toolkit designed certainly for parents and families and educators and those folks with important kids in their life to have these conversations with young people. But I think it can really be a great resource and a helpful resource for everyone. So if you're listening, I would definitely encourage you to check it out, print it out for yourself, or look at it online. I think the work that the toolkit does to get us to critically think about and have conversations about policing and community safety, abolition, really what true justice is and what true transformational justice is and can look like for our society is just really well done in this toolkit. And there's so much to learn and take away from it. So I'm thrilled to be able to sort of amplify this, get to talk about it. The other sort of related thought that I had about this was how this toolkit really pushes us to embrace the power of transformative thinking and imagination, really, right? And we've talked about radical thought and imagination here on this podcast before, thanks to a lot of incredible thinkers and organizers who we've interacted with here before. But I think this is just another great tool to allow us to do that, right? And to hopefully get us to that world to dream about, right? And hopefully one day see that world we so desperately need, right?
Yeah. I think this fits into so many other things that we've read and talked about and reflected on here today. So I'm excited to,
and it's a practical way to do that as well, right?
Absolutely. And I finished reading it the other day before recording. I was like, this is so good. That was my first, as I closed out, as I put it down, I was like, this is so good. I'm excited to talk about it.
Very good.
So one of the things I mentioned earlier I wanted to highlight and talk about is the section on punishment versus consequences.
Okay.
Which has some really great examples about the differences, a case study, and there's a little section about transforming punishment at home.
Yes. So good.
Kind of what that looks like.
Yeah.
And one of the key factors that Rania writes about here in this section is that consequences are natural in a lot of ways and not necessarily imposed by people. And I think that's a great way to talk to kids about consequences for our actions, just in the sort of that cause and effect kind of manner.
Yes.
So already great stuff in my opinion. And then she created a chart with some differences between punishment and consequences. A couple of these examples are, quote, arbitrary, not connected to transformation or restoration, punishes past behavior. So that's a description of punishment versus connected to restoring or creating safety for the collective, which is a description of consequences. And then for punishment, again, meant to coerce, bully, or force someone to behave in a particular way versus, quote, meant to teach through cause and effect.
Yes.
And I just really like the chart in that it points out these differences between the two things, between punishment and consequences. And then she gets into some more about that. She talks about the way that fear is the main driver of punishment and points out what living with fear can do to someone. Based on research, she pulled a few things out, includes brain shrinkage, reduced creativity and poor academic performance, emotional dysregulation, and then future aggressive or impulsive behavior. And that's just living with fear.
Right, and if that's what does to you.
Right. If that's what is driving punishment. Right. It's just thinking about how this isn't really helpful to people as they're developing or growing potentially.
No.
And so, I mentioned she wrote about what punishment at home kind of looks like and transforming what that looks like and what, I think this is one of the sections she's writing specifically to the parents.
Yes, 100%.
Or to the adults, right, who are connected to kids. And so she closes that section or that page with, many of us can look back at our childhoods and realize that fear and punishment made us more concerned with not being caught than with changing our behavior. Which I think for me drives home the point from earlier on that page that our family units, our homes, are usually where we're first learning about coercive power through being punished.
Yes.
And through that sort of fear that happens when we are, we're self-correcting, not because we've learned something or we learned what we should be doing, but we've learned what we are not supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And we don't want to get punished for that again.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily the effective learning tool that I think we kind of think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's the one that just sort of comes naturally to us, right? Just given our disposition and the ways in which we're taught that at home, right?
Yeah.
As you sort of talk about. Yeah, I'm glad you talked about this one. I wanted to as well. I mean, the punishment and consequences section was just great. And it really does, as you say, lay this foundation for really the importance of having these conversations at home, right? And how that is rooted in sort of young people's then lived experiences beyond the home, right? Potentially. And we see how these things play out in our society as well, right?
Yeah, this is all connected to sort of carceral thinking.
Yes.
And she makes that connection very explicitly at the beginning of that section to make a connection between the way that we punish at home, the way that we interact with one another at home is important.
Yes.
and is connected to what abolition kind of looks like.
Absolutely. And this idea that then if we can work with kids and children and young people in their homes, right, what and be transformative in that, right, like what that might mean for these larger systems.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, there are so many incredible resources and activities in this toolkit. I think, I'm going to talk about one here in a second. I think we could spend entire episodes on these activities. I think we could even spend an episode doing an activity, right? Like they're really well done. And so you talked about that one. I want to talk about the resource called 10 Questions for Rethinking Police and Prisons. It was really good. It was the first one. And I think it was a really great way to invite us and to invite children to think about the ways in which society talks about police and policing and notions of safety. And I'm going to quote her here. It was a great resource to, quote, foster a sense of skepticism about the way things are and a sense of possibility for the way things could be.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so each of the 10 questions is paired with additional prompts and ideas and even more questions and just facts to consider alongside the work necessary to answer the original question, right? And sort of really develop in your thinking around these topics, which I thought was just really great. And like the questions themselves are simple, right? And I'm going to share them here. I want to do that. But it's really sort of the accompanying prompts and ideas and facts that I think really make this an incredible resource, right? Because you can use it with really young children, but it can grow with children too. And it allows you to sort of add additional pieces of information as you think about these concepts. I also think, and we've said this a couple of times, right? But the concepts here are great in terms of folks who maybe are early on in their journey around learning about abolition too, right? So there's use for this for everybody. So the 10 questions are this, and you'll see they're really simple. So the first one is, what do the police say they do? Number 2, what do you think the police actually do? 3, do they need guns to do it? 4, why do we call the police? 5, who else might we call and how can they help us? 6, who goes to prison? 7, why do we send people to prison? 8, what happens once people are in prison and what happens when or if they get out? 9, what makes you feel safe and what makes a community feel safe? And 10, who is a, quote, bad guy or person? What makes someone bad? Once you are bad, can you be good again? Yeah. So really, like I said, 10 simple questions, right? But so much in the way I think of good quality work can come from exploring each of those questions and the accompanying sort of elements of the chart in each question.
Yeah, because as you said, the elements of the chart add additional layers to the conversation.
Yes.
And so if you get to a point where you're stumped in the conversation, you can ask a question from that.
Yes.
Or add another element that will sort of help the conversation along.
Absolutely. And I think that's so good.
It's so good.
As you have these conversations with young ones, right? Like you have your sort of thinking, right? But you have to meet a kid where they are. And sometimes kids can ask you questions out of left field, right? Sometimes, or they are stuck, right? And you want to sort of really figure out the way to guide them, through that confusion or that understanding process. And so just a great resource.
Yeah, absolutely. That and having that open up the whole activity, I was like, this is great.
Yeah.
So jumping to the in our own hands section, really explores how we reconsider our responses to conflict and harm, like I mentioned sort of at the top. And it builds from this previous section about punishment that I was talking about and gets into transformative justice, what it means and how to explain it to kids, which I thought, I think it's close to perfect in terms of, as you said, meeting kids where they are and helping them understand sort of a different way to think about what justice might mean. So she says, quote, transformative justice means working together to figure out what to do when people hurt people without adding to all that hurt. When we practice transformative justice, we think about how we stop that hurt from happening again instead of just punishing people. We also think about helping people heal. There are lots of ways we already do this in our families, friends, and neighborhoods. we're not trying to decide who is bad or guilty. We're trying to figure out how we can change this situation and help with healing. And it so nicely sums up transformative justice processes and conflict resolution, which are connected but not the same. And they're grounded in community. They're grounded in relationships.
Yes, they are. Yes.
And when you pair that with, on the next page, she includes some practices to, quote, co-learn with little ones that are about transformative justice, and they're about conflict resolution. It's really just an amazing resource to take all together to use to explain what this could look like in your family or in your community. I think it's such a good example of, for people who maybe haven't had the chance to think about, like, what are the ways that I am sort of punishing my kids, or how are we resolving conflict at home? And it's such a good way to sort of unpack all of that in a really constructive way that actually has, like, tangible things you can do.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's so great.
It is. I love that you talk about sort of this idea of it being these things being grounded in community and relationships, right? And then sort of connecting it to that activity that talks about co-learning with little ones, right? Like, we are in relationships with these little people in our life, right? We're in relationship with them to help them become the best versions of themselves, right? And to become members of our community, our larger community, right?
Yeah.
And so like, all of it just, to me, what's so great about this is that it all works so well together. And she was really intentional about how the activities connect to the narratives, right? And to the stories, and connecting to the why of why this is all so important for us, but also for the little people in our lives. So I enjoyed that one too. That's so good. One of the other sections that stood out to me was exploring the concepts of good versus bad.
Yeah, this is so good.
Right. And, I had to take a step back here because, people know this listening. I'm not a parent myself, but I do know that exploring and teaching the idea of good versus bad is a real cornerstone, right, of raising kids, right? Like, you want your child, you want this little person to be good, right? We want kids to grow up and to know that concept, obviously, right? But the activity here gets to an important aspect of teaching the notion of good versus bad, which is that this can lead to an overly simplistic and judgmental view of the world, right? That binary can lead to that, right? And so it can lead to this judgmental view of people. It can lead to a judgmental view of people's actions. And as we think about and talk about policing and what the police and the criminal punishment system do, we know that this kind of thinking has limited our collective humanity. And so I appreciated the importance of this activity in the toolkit and the power that it has for, as we're having these conversations with children. I also, I think as an aside, one of the other reflections that I had after reading through this activity was how this notion of good versus bad thinking has much greater applicability in our society than just the context that this toolkit presents it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we talked last week about all of the anti-trans legislation that's popping up across the country. And I couldn't help but think about, this good versus bad thinking and the ways in which the folks proposing that legislation, supporting that legislation, have a limited ability to comprehend and accept the humanity of others, right? Or the other, quote unquote, the other, right? And how that's related to this, and another reason why exploring and understanding this concept of good versus bad is so critically important to our society, to our humanity, our collective humanity, So,
yeah. Well, and I think that you talked about how important the good versus bad concept is. And it's just so ingrained in everything too. Like, there's so much in the stories that we tell, just in books, in TV, in any kind of media that reinforces good versus bad. And there aren't a ton of examples that get at that question that was earlier in the list of questions you said. Once you're bad, can you be good again?
Yeah.
There's not always that nuance in the conversation either, where it's like, well, they did something bad, and it doesn't mean that they are bad,
Right.
Actually, on another tangent, we were watching an episode of Bluey over the weekend.
Good show.
And they had there's one about the bad mood, and it sort of closes with sort of this kind of concept. It's not about being a bad person, but it's that behavior doesn't always match who you are.
Yes. That's such a good point.
Yeah, and so it's very much connected
lesson
to this good person versus bad person kind of mentality.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I just watched that and I was like, oh, this is really great. And
Yeah.
it ties in with what I'm reading.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Life imitates art.
Yes.
Imitates life. Good.
Yeah. All right. Well, this seems like a great place to shift our conversation and talk about application,
Okay.
how this applies to our day-to-day lives. I think a great summary of how I think about applying this is in the orientation memo, where Rania writes, as we explore these transformative conversations with our children, we ourselves are working to unlearn the conditioning of carceral punishment. We are both guiding little ones and learning with and from them. As we navigate our shared thoughts and actions, we remain immersed in a world which reinforces the very systems that create and amplify harm in our lives. We must recognize that our learning, including that of little ones around us, is not linear. This toolkit, I think, is all about how we understand the world around us and the ways that we can subtly reinforce carceral forms of thinking, and how we can unpack that and reverse it in our own sort of area of influence, our own spheres of influence.
Yes.
And I think that that's an important thing to be out in the world. And so that's my application, is that quote from the orientation memo at the beginning of this toolkit.
I love it. I love that you brought that memo up because it's important. It's an important section of this toolkit, and sort of a guide for how to use it. And you're absolutely right in thinking about the power of this toolkit being a way to understand our world and the world around us. I think, that speaks to my application. That the toolkit itself is the application, right? It's literally designed to be this resource for us to use and to engage with, to learn about abolition and what true justice is, and then to be able to apply that knowledge to our everyday lives, right, and the work we do, and to our conversations with young people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all of that is so important, especially when we think about the fact that we know that systems and structures of oppression only continue and get stronger when they aren't challenged and opposed, right? So I think the application here is that there is a lot of power in a resource like this one in conjunction with lots of other things out there, and how it can be used with young people to inspire their thinking, their education, their ability to learn and understand, and then ultimately fight these systems and structures, right? Because they're ultimately going to be the ones who live in this world and fight for it and create the world we want to see. I'm also really inspired, again, mentioning that I'm not a parent, right? But this idea of, how I might be able to use this with the important kids in my life, right? In conjunction with their parents who, if there's an important kid in their life, I clearly care about their parents, right? Like how am I sort of, as someone who looks like me, holds the identities that I have interacting with little people, and holding the beliefs that I do about all of this, right? Like how might I have conversations when I'm maybe one-on-one with one of those young people, right? And something happens, or there's something we see on TV, right? Or there's some incident in the world, because there's clearly something happening every minute of every day, right? As our watches light up with new notifications about the craziness of the world. So I also think there's a lot of application for the folks listening who, like me, don't have kids of your own, but who very much so love some important children in your life, right? There are ways that everyone can use this.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah. So, let's talk about homework.
All right.
How we're going to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today.
All right.
And one of the things that Rania has created is called Anatomy of an Apology, which has been circulated on social media as a sort of Instagram post carousel thing, and as a one-sheet handout. So it names different parts of an apology, from consent to centering the hurt to accountability and change behavior, and a couple other things. I think there's just a lot of parallels between that resource and this toolkit we read.
Yes.
The toolkit has a sort of flower of an apology,
Yes.
and what that looks like. So I want to spend a little time with that and reflect on how I can use that in my own life too, in addition to sort of this toolkit and bringing that into, bringing that into my own world.
I love it. I'm triggered a little bit because I've talked recently about apologies in therapy. So the idea of what an apology is, what it actually looks like versus what you sometimes get. I think there's a lot of important work that folks can do in this area.
Yep.
And so I love that she includes that. And you're right, there is lots of stuff out there about this. So that's always good homework, I think. You mentioned at the top of this episode that this toolkit ends with a list of great books to engage with young folks with, right? And so it's these like 30 some odd books, I think, that she called radical reads. And as you said, it was broken up by age range. And so, obviously these books are for children, but I want to sort of check them out, get a sense of what they are. Maybe I can, maybe this is determining some upcoming purchases I might make for some of the little and not so little ones in my life. But I think it's just a great resource to have, and a great way to end this. Anything that has additional ways to continue your learning, I think like A+ work. And so I want to check out those books and see what they offer.
Yeah, and there's a couple on here from Miriam Kaba.
Yes.
She's written a couple of kids' books. Let the Children March, which is about children participating in the Selma and the Montgomery bus boycott. So there's a lot of great stuff here. And then up into 7 and 12-year-olds, talking about even more things, and then teens and up. So
what a great
stuff.
resource. Yeah. Absolutely. Very good.
Right. Awesome. Well, some good homework. But Damien, you're up next time. So what do you bring to the table in our next episode?
I am. So I am going to bring a piece from Truth Out to the table for us to talk about. We have read a few things from Truth Out, always been really good stuff. So I'm excited for this. The piece itself is called U.S. Fascism is Spreading Under the Guise of, quote, Patriotic Education. And it was written by Henry A. Giroux, who is both a professor and just a well-renowned author, and was actually just published last week on Truth Out's website. So you can find it there. So it's new, it's out there, and I'm excited for us to talk about it. I think the piece itself, the title of it, definitely speaks to what it's all about. But I think we've got to continue to have these kinds of conversations to sort of name and call out what the right is doing in terms of, this war that they're raging on Black people and people of color and their lives, right? And on our educational system, and what we can and cannot teach. And I think really trying to sort of normalize white supremacy in this country.
Even more so,
right? And so we've got to do that work. And so I think this will be a really great piece. I got to sort of glance through it, and there's a lot of incredible folks quoted in it. It seems like it's going to be a really great article. So I'm super excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. Not the whole concept of it, but
Yeah.
sounds like a great thing for us to talk about and continue to hone our analysis.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the folks in your life, follow us on social media, check us out on YouTube, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.